Greetings and welcome to this short online series called Raging Against the Machine, Popular School Against AI. In our program, we address problems, possibilities, and politics that haunt our understanding of AI with some of the leading critics, writers, and thinkers of our times. We aim for these conversations to be a modest contribution to the political education that many are searching for around and against AI, and we hope that they offer some much needed context and reframing and sharp anti-capitalist class analyses that can enrich our organizing and our resistance efforts. Please subscribe to this channel and to the Common Notions newsletter so you can easily find the next conversations in the popular school. Today, we have three guests who are all cognitive scientists of some form, so that makes 4 cognitive scientists in this particular panel. We have Victor Gomez, who is a psycholinguist who, by day and by night, Victor runs a Neo-Luddite reading group. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow with Snedeker and Bergelsson Lab at Harvard Psychology, and he is interested in the relationship between language and thought. And then we have from across the pond, from Europe, we have Olivia Guest and Iris van Rooij joining us, who are both at Radboud University in Nijmegen. Olivia is an assistant professor of computational cognitive science, and Iris is a computational cognitive scientist at the School of Artificial Intelligence and the Faculty of Social Sciences, I believe. Iris and Olivia have been very vocal in joining arguments from cognitive science about critical perspectives on AI with a more broadly critical perspective on AI in education. And so today we're going to be talking about the role that AI currently is playing, the threats that we are facing, and what we might want to be doing about AI in the context of education and in the context of science. And I thought I'd start us off with a lovely photo quote that I found in one of your papers that I've come across many times, which is flying pigs are also possible in principle. Possible in principle doesn't bake bread. So I was wondering if the three of you might want to get a little bit into the way that possibilities are currently claimed, and then the way that that is often misleading, and how you feel that AI is getting pushed, and how you feel that what the real effects of AI in the current moment are that we should really focus on. Olivia, do you want to maybe go first?
Oh, thanks for the really nice introduction. The quote I think is from a photo, but I don't know exactly where Iris found it. I think the thing about possibilities, or at least the way I understand what you want me to say, is that there's a lot of mainstream acceptance of the idea that these technologies that are essentially products from the tech industry are somehow able to do the various things that they're claimed to do. And this is like, there's a mainstream acceptance. So this is like taken as a given, and then people reason from there. But this is like a very problematic starting point. So for example, when people say that these AI technologies can help you search the internet to find the answer to something, it's just not the case. So you don't even need to accept this as an actual property of the technology. And I think ultimately what happens in these discussions or in these understandings of the technologies is that the reasoning assumes that the essentially marketing of the tech industry is something to be taken at face value. And actually, this has nothing to do with AI specifically. We should never take marketing at face value, exactly because it shouldn't. You should never do that. You should never assume that a company trying to sell you something is necessarily interested in your best. The only thing they're interested in is probably your money at the end of the day. So either your tax money or your actual money, but which is what we see, which is, is it's all very heightened now, where we see these tech companies in bed with the US government and so on. But I think even before that, you can just reason from common sense. So like if a tobacco company claims that, the filters on a cigarette remove tar, and therefore these are fine, these specific cigarettes are better than the other ones. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think anyone in 2026 would take this seriously, even if it's true that some cigarettes are less bad for you than others. Even if that's true, it's not a normal way of reasoning to assume that just because something is a little bit less bad than something else, then that means it's okay. And we've seen this many times before, and I think the problem with the current status of these mainstream views on AI technologies is that somehow people suspend their disbelief as if this is a completely different way of thinking. So like when it comes to cigarettes, I think people think very sensibly and normally, even though in the past maybe they didn't. In the present, they likely do. Whereas when it comes to AI technologies, it's like all critical thinking is now in the bin. And also as if educational perspectives, so like for example, a teacher isn't anymore an expert on what should and shouldn't be in the classroom. And I don't know like how my colleagues in this conversation exactly see it, but I think we've all seen the wider acceptance of academia of this logic is in some senses very startling, I think, because normally academics are very critical. I don't know if this is an opportunity for other people to come in, but I think, for me, this was one of my biggest disappointments in my colleagues.
Victor, you seem like you want to engage with that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this is related to the possibilities and definitely the criticism. I've been this is focusing on research and theory, right? But I've been kind of surprised at how there's just been kind of a lack of skepticism when it comes to a lot of these claims that then get ported into theory, right? So not only can it, be a good search engine or summarizer, right? But maybe this is how we learn or something like that, right? Or maybe it has representation of language that it's built up, like us or whatever, like it's built a world model or something emergent. It feels like there's this, when it comes to like possibilities, it feels like there's been a real, I don't know, closing of possibilities in the sense that it feels like people are kind of almost more scared to be proven wrong, to say, this is a task that, can or can't be automated using some formal system for this reason. Because, we've been wrong before, because we've seen so many waves of, AI research that do things that, at one point people said, oh, a machine can never do X. And of course, there's no conversation to be had about how much they can do X, right? And how much we're fudging that. But it feels like on the theoretical side, there's just this fear that is getting in the way of skepticism, of saying something that might be wrong, right? Of saying, well, actually, they, aren't learning, this representation or whatever. And here's why, because, well, maybe with more data, or more parameters, or, with a little tweak of like how it, searches through the data, it will be able to, accomplish that task, or, have some signature that you claimed it couldn't have. And so echoing with what Olivia's been saying, both the adoption, right, in terms of workflow and stuff like that, but even the way we do research and think about our explanations and our theorizing has really, it's been surprising the lack of skepticism and pushback people have, especially because we're not in a. I think one of the roles of a scientist is to be deeply skeptical and think about other ways that some set of data could have been generated, right, and to really kind of get in those weeds. So to me, this kind of lack of skepticism just doesn't feel conducive to scientific labor, to the scientific program. I don't know how others feel, but that's when I think about possibilities and this, like, well, it could do anything. So let's not say it can or can't, or, it struggles here or there, because maybe, in a year, things are moving so fast, we'll be proven wrong.
Go ahead, Iris.
To add my 2 cents. So yeah, thanks for these thoughts and also for the introduction. And I share both the disappointment in educators and in scientists and in colleagues. Also the observation of like all critical thinking or skepticism out of the window. I want to get back to the quote, but maybe to plant a seed for later, that I feel that even these technologies, besides there being a lack of skepticism, that they also actually de-skill our ability to critically think. So it's sort of a double bad. Maybe we come back to it in a moment. I wanted to still go back to the possibility in the quote, which comes from it's originally from Fodor, and we quoted Olivia and I and others in our paper, Reclaiming AI as a Theoretical Tool for Cognitive Science. And I want to come back to the theme also of your question of possibility and overestimating possibilities. I also think cognitive science really, as you mentioned, we're here with four cognitive scientists. I think cognitive science has a special or important role also to play, since the claims of possibilities here are, as I see it, claims about cognitive abilities of machines. And this is also what our paper was about, where we actually try to argue through what is a formalized thought experiment, actually to argue that these claims, like we are on an inevitable path with these technological breakthroughs towards artificial general intelligence, that this is utterly misleading, this claim. It's implausible. Indeed, the idea is that if we only were to have more data, then this would be possible. Then we would get to human level cognition in AI. Then we can replace all kinds of professionals, educators, doctors, lawyers, etc. But the thing is, the amount of data required to make that work is astronomical. So that's not realistically going to happen. And just wanted to sort of add that to the points of Olivia and Victor, that I think is a useful lens to also really think about what are these claims. Oh, and related to what Victor said about, indeed, there's a narrative. But we thought before things weren't possible, but now we see they are. But the thing is, no, they're not. What happens now is, people are fooled into thinking that the systems with which they are interacting have some kind of intelligence. We actually know also from psychology, it doesn't actually take so much to convince people that this is the case. And so there is actually no empirical evidence that we made any breakthroughs. And on theoretical and computational grounds, we can argue, no, we made no substantive breakthroughs in the fundamental computational problems that are obstacles to actually getting us to even scientifically understand human level cognition, let alone be able to reproduce it. That's my addition.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I definitely want to get back to the de-skilling question. I think there's a very big part that we should tackle from a variety of angles. So one thing that's of interest to me, in a sense, in this context, is kind of the meta question too. One of the question of why is there so little critical pushback, or maybe to put it another way, why is so much of the critical pushback that does exist? So why doesn't it have more reach, right? And I think So one of the ways that I've been thinking about it, and Ingeborg has been thinking about it, and we've been writing about it, is to think about, in a sense, the fact that we are approaching this from the internal logic of science. But as Olivia very rightly pointed out, they're not producing scientific theories. They're not producing scientific objects. They're using the language of science in order to sell products, right? And I think we can see that we're in a moment very broadly and narrowly about AI, where the relationship of capitalist society at large and science is undergoing certain shifts, right? I mean, in the US in particular, we can see that universities are very strongly under political attack, that free speech is getting attacked, that the question of what kind of questions can be investigated are getting politicized. And so for me, I think for scientists, there's maybe a moment of reckoning, of rethinking about, well, why is it that a society like the ones that we are living in is funding science? When did that start to the degree, right? It's not like we've always had universities like this. It's very clear that after World War II, part of the massive increase in funding for science was because all science had proved to be of immense military use, right? I mean, we know that that you can't have nuclear bombs without having nuclear physicists. And so I think scientists often, because they're very invested in their community-driven questions that are generated by science, that are answered in accordance with the logic that the problem itself generates, often tend to forget about this, take that particular thing for granted. And I think AI right now is maybe a thing that convinces more and more people who do make these kinds of funding questions that maybe we don't need as many scientists, right? In a sense, there's a sense of like, you don't necessarily always need a good theory, or that may be very false. But I think it's worth for us to think about the fact that very often in the real world, in the world that is not occupied by scientists, people aren't interested so much in what is right and what is wrong, but in what is good enough, right? I think it's very useful for us to think about the question of what economists call the marginal utility, right? And if you think about something like, let's take something that is a little less insane than the language models, you think about the models for protein folding, right? That too is a domain where neural networks have been used very successfully. And as far as I see it, that is also a technical substitute for a theory, right? A theory actually has abstractions and causal connections and so on. And now we've trained a model to predict the three-dimensional shape of a protein from its amino acid sequence, right? But that is not a causal theory. But it is a thing that if you're doing biochemical research of a certain kind, can stand in for a theory, right? It does give you if you're not interested in the theory, if you're not in it for the science, but because you want to make particular molecules to sell on the market, let's say, right? If you're in the chemical engineering question, that is maybe good enough for you, right? So in a sense, what I think, is the sense in which the margin of actual science over this kind of fake science may be decreasing in certain domains. And I think that's a threat to science. And I think that is a way in which our society is currently economically producing anti-intellectual forces. And I think these kinds of reasons are very important to think about the role, make it very clear that it's very important to think about the role of scientists in larger society, because I think ultimately this path that kind of development leads us onto is a path of massive power imbalances, where all the power in society is in very few hands, where actual productivity increases don't happen as much as we would like, right? It's not going to bring wealth for everyone. It's going to bring about a far worse world. But we see that these kinds of objects, these kinds of results of scientific processes are leveraged in this way to disempower people. So I'm interested in how you all feel about the role of scientists in society, the role of universities in society, how that might be changing. And perhaps on a personal level, do you feel like people who work on cognitive science, I think, is an intersection of the social and the natural sciences in a way that is relatively particular in the world of academia? I wonder if you think that puts cognitive scientists in particular in a special position in this kind of context.
Yeah, there's a lot to say. I think something specific about cognitive science maybe is indeed what you said, that it kind of straddles like the humanities and the social sciences and I guess computer science would be neither of those two. But I also think, to go back to another point that you raised about how maybe we're in a special moment, and then I'll try to link it up with maybe what cognitive scientists have to offer, is that I think the older generations who are maybe now entering retirement, so the baby boomers and those people had a very different both academic life but also life in general, and we're seeing the end of that. And I don't think that's a coincidence that this is coinciding with a rise, a significant rise in anti-intellectualism and anti-university sentiment, because, for example, to give the case of the UK, in 1993 is when they stopped university being free. So from 1993 onwards, so basically my generation and the generation before me couldn't go, so I'm a millennial, couldn't go to university for free anymore. And I think this is part of, it's an example of the wave of anti-intellectualism, because the only reason at a societal level that you would want to limit access to higher education is because the working classes, so people whose security depends on having a job, making that clear because working class means different things in different countries, but if we just take it to mean that whose people's security depends on them being employed as opposed to generational wealth, had free access to education. And only higher education really allows the kind of thinking that would directly dismantle the kind of logics that the tech companies are pushing onto us. And all of these things, I mean, there's an equivalent wave or example or part of this wave in the US with probably starting with Ronald Reagan being worried about people having access in the California university system to education, higher education. So I think we're seeing the result of these policies because, of course, these policies take a long time to have an effect. It might seem, and I think this is part of the trick of AI, by the way, in general, and of the moment that we're in, is that things seem to be very quick. Like, oh, some AI company CEO said something, boom, everything is different now. And then, or then a new version of some software, boom, everything is different, forget the past. And it's actually, there's a reason they want you to forget the past. And it's exactly because knowledge of the past is part and parcel of what will set you free. And that's also what academic knowledge is. It's small incremental changes to a huge body of knowledge. So I think we're seeing the effect of these long-term policies that have created the newer generations of scientists who, unfortunately, are not engaged politically. And also, it creates an academic elite who can only survive in academia exactly because they have intergenerational wealth. They only go to university because they have the ability to go into debt, or they don't even go into debt, right? But of course, going into debt is itself is a kind of privilege, because poorer people can't have a lot of debt. That's kind of the whole point. So I think the trying to link this back now to cognitive science is that I think cognitive science is an interdiscipline or whatever, like some collection of fields that is itself under attack. Like there aren't many departments of cognitive science in the sense of offering educational programs at the university level. It's not. I don't think I know more than a couple. So it's again part and parcel, because to be it's part and parcel of the damage to higher education, because to be interdisciplinary, it takes longer. And for things to take longer, they're more quote unquote expensive, because you need to spend more of your life on them. So I think, yes, cognitive scientists maybe are in some sense uniquely placed, but I also think it's really important as in uniquely placed to attack AI rhetorically and defend maybe even universities. But I also think maybe the unique placement of cognitive science and their contribution as scientists is to say that actually everyone could have a reason to, everyone's expertise is valuable. Like a historian can also attack AI using their discipline. And I think I gave that example just because history isn't normally seen as a cognitive science, although I think it should be. But the point is, like, or a legal scholar, they also should feel liberated to use their expertise to criticize the current moment. But I think the reason this doesn't happen, and maybe the reason cognitive scientists are more likely to do it, is because we have, we know a bit of computer science, we know a bit of neuroscience, we know a bit of educational science. So I think this is maybe what allows us to say, yeah, you know what, actually, this is all nonsense. And when someone claims that a machine can do something, the lowest form of critique, which is maybe still difficult for people to do, is to say, well, a human built that machine. So clearly, cognition is entirely central and relevant. And this is the case, and I'll bring in an example from history, and then I'll allow other people say what they think. But like this has always been the case. So clocks, mechanical calendars have existed from at least ancient Greece. And they are a mechanical representation of, in the case of ancient Greeks' understanding of the solar system. And the clock is a clockwork clock is a very clear example. The cogs move as the planets move, and so on. And I think we need to engage with this actively. Like, these artifacts are not some kind of unknowable or unknown assemblage of things. They're not out there in the world. They're the products of our cognition. And by the way, that also makes us responsible for them. So in the case of the AI products, everyone in society is responsible for the damage they do. Yeah.
Shall I add? Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I also think that cognitive scientists can also help, or I also try, for instance, in my own teaching, to link back to the common sense that Olivia referred to empower people to realize their own cognition. So what I notice is that when people buy into the industry narrative that what is it, we either already have or are making super intelligent. I've also heard people say, "Oh, this system is smarter than me," and I mean, it's very painful. It's also false. But to really make aware, because this is. I've been thinking about why are people susceptible to this, and I think people both underestimate their own cognition, and they overestimate what is computationally possible. And I think as cognitive scientists, we can also educate on both of these, both that there are fundamental limits to what can be computationally realized, but also how amazing human cognition is. For instance, indeed, that we make actually such systems, or what is it, clockworks, or other kinds of fascinating things. But also that what all counts as cognition goes far beyond what these kinds of systems claim to emulate. Yeah, even the conversation that we are having now and these reflections, but also maybe some problem solving stuff we do for fun, all kinds of activities, cognitive activities that we do, art, music, etc. And that cognitive science can also, but of course for this, or this going back to what's the role of university and education, we need to foster this knowledge, but at the same time, the knowledge is destroyed. So this is what I notice is that we need to foster, but also it seems to me that the kinds of developments of AI, also the push of AI into the educational system, is destroying both people's own understanding of their own cognition, but also the scientific knowledge that we have actually about what is cognition, also what's a good education. This is what I wanted to add on the cognitive science point. I also wanted to say something going back to your point, if I may, about the good enough. So you said people say, oh, but now we can do things efficiently and it's good enough. And I want to say it's not good enough. I remember actually it's, I think we end maybe even our paper against the uncritical adoption of AI technologies in academia. I think we end on this point that it's important to realize that these technologies are not good enough. The narrative is that they're sold this way. And often there's the appeals, for instance, like you said about the protein fold. Oh, look what, well, it claims AI, but of course we know we can do computer simulation, we can automate stuff like this, nothing fancy there. But about the adoption of AI technologies in society, for instance, for, maybe I will say more about it later, for psychotherapy or for giving more efficient education to poorer kids that otherwise wouldn't have access. But we know that this is not good enough. Actually, these are scams. These are harmful, and we know the people that do have the money, they don't want these technologies, and they're only good enough for making money.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. That is exactly where I think we should lead this question, the question of good enough for what. And I think it is precisely the case that they're good enough to make money, but they're not good enough to make a good society. They will, in fact, have exactly this effect that to people who are already economically disadvantaged will be more and more economically disadvantaged. Their access to things like therapy will be even more curtailed than it already is. And more people from that consider themselves middle class will also experience these kinds of services to be more and more out of reach, right? So in a sense, that's where I think it is important to have a broad understanding of how capitalism operates, to be like, well, unfortunately, capitalism is a system that allocates decision powers to precisely the kinds of people who think the most important way of making decisions is the question of profit, because of course the profit can be reinvested and that restructures society, right? So I think that's where the political question of, well, what kind of decisions make for a good society, and are markets really the way that we should be allocating these kinds of decision powers, are something that we really need to take into account. And yes, I absolutely think, and we've written this multiple times, that what it means for things to be good enough is often the destruction of quality as long as it is cheap enough, right? I think the model on the side of the consumer, I think the model that we should be thinking about when we think about AI is that it is bringing the model of fast fashion to the production of thought and text, right? Which is to make everything into cheap, but extremely available, extremely quick things. And then that often outcompetes the market, right? We know that it is much harder now to buy quality clothes or shoes or whatever than it was 30, 40 years ago. It's a very common experience of the last decades in all kinds of domains. And I think with AI, we see the same kind of logic where the market actually destroys reasonable quality as long as it can produce more and more and faster. We see that kind of logic arriving in production domains where white collar workers more broadly have not experienced this thing yet. But I think that's a good opportunity to show that the conception of working class, as you brought up, Olivia, should really be a broad one where these particularities may be less relevant than the larger, very structural fact of, well, do you depend on a wage or a salary on a living, or do you depend on having inherited access to capital? Victor, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I don't know if this is taking it more in the what is it that is being lost or cheapened. But in your example of the protein folding, scientists disagree about what makes a good theory. For me, I think, and I mean this is kind of Fodor's thing too. I especially for like the special sciences, I think a theory being counterfactual supporting. So you say, look, I think this happens. But, if this other stuff goes on, yada, 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 we probably won't see that. We'll see this, being able to generalize to an extent that helps you reason about, like failure cases, what else would occur. I think people have very different opinions. That's at least one of mine. And when I think about modeling, I wouldn't like just want to denigrate modeling entirely. But I do think, might it be more expedient than developing something like that counterfactual understanding in some cases, which to me, I'm at least of the camp that thinks universities or like science, it's like a project, and the arts and so on, are like a projects of like human understanding. And yeah. And so I think that when you do have this case where understanding, right, is a way to get things done, to make some money, you get this weird kind of like, with de-skilling comes upskilling, and you get some experts, right, that are, allowed a bit more luxury or freedom, right? Like I think faculty to some extent, right, have this kind of a special privileged position. I mean, I'll say in the US, I don't know how every academia is structured everywhere, but in terms of like this notion of like faculty self-governance, right? So like faculty in a department here, get to decide on who they hire, right? It's not just like handed down. They make certain votes about how the department should be run, how the courses should be taught. And I'm sure, I haven't been involved in this. I'm sure there's a lot of problems, but, there's this notion that you do have like some, leeway that isn't just, the dean coming in and saying, well, I chose this person, you have to do this. But is this a very American thing to say? Okay. But I think that when, that those cases where there's kind of that privilege, that's not, I think ideally from like a, the point of view of like capital, ideally you don't have those people. You just get kind of the outputs of whatever they do, right? The people are kind of like a nuisance in a sense that you like accept and give some degree of freedom, throw some privileges, throw some, more money relative to other people or something, so that you can get like this product. And I think when you have, this modeling frenzy, I do think part of that comes from this desire to kind of embody knowledge in something other than a human that has rights under our, general conception in like a, I don't know, liberal democracy, right? Like into something that just produces. And I think, and that can be owned and that can be bought and transferred, right? And I think part of that is it reminds me Lewis Mumford in Technics and Civilization, when he gives his account of the Industrial Revolution, he kind of makes this point that like we really romanticize the inventors of the Industrial Revolution, and go like, oh wow, James Watt and the steam engine. We remember certain names and we're like, they invented this. But he points out that like for a decent portion of the Industrial Revolution and long afterwards, inventors were more entrepreneurs than scientists. They didn't have like working theories about in some cases like electricity or fluid dynamics or whatever you would need. They were just trying stuff out and kind of seeing what would stick, and it was this very like empirical in the sense, right, that they were like making small adjustments and seeing what worked, but it wasn't motivated by like them being like, well, I think if this is the problem, then based on my calculations, it's just like, oh, there's this small problem, maybe if I do this, well, that didn't quite work, I'll try another thing, right? And so I think Mumford optimistically thinks we're out of that era, or at least in Technics and Civilization. But maybe, that era is not so bad, because then you don't need to have these experts that, have a privileged position that you need to kind of look the other way or limit your power around, even if it's not that big in the scheme of things, right? I don't know. That's kind of my thinking. And that's when I think about losing theory, losing understanding. I think understanding is kind of inconvenient to the like capitalist project, in as much as like, one, it might be detrimental to it. It might make you less susceptible to marketing. It might make you, question some aspects about the structure of things. But two, it kind of means that they're experts, and experts are annoying. Like, it'd be great to not have experts. They could speak up and say that what you're doing is wrong. They could use their position, right? So I don't know. That's kind of what I think about here when thinking about what is understanding worth. And I do think a lot of scientists now, a surprising amount, seem to think that maybe the world is so complex that we can't understand it, or that there are theories that that we need to have like certain models or something to uncover things that our mind might be too limited to do. And to me, that's just kind of odd, because I think the project is human understanding, right? I want to be able to articulate why. I want to be able to hypothesize. I don't want to get like a printout that says, well, this works or this doesn't. So I don't know. Those are kind of my thoughts on this, like cheapening and the quality that's being lost, I guess, in my sense, is that kind of understanding. And I totally echo what Iris was saying, of people really undervaluing the richness of their own cognition and tying it into what Olivia's saying. I think this also is kind of like a systemic educational problem. Like, you don't learn about cognitive science unless you stumble into it in college, really. I don't know if that's the experience the two of you had, but you don't learn like, oh wow, like the way I perceive the world is so richly structured and we know so much about it. And we could, but we don't. I don't know. And I think that makes us susceptible to this kind of like condescending view of humanity or of learners. I don't know.
I want to comment on something that Victor said, because it made me laugh in a good way and a bad way, which is that I think academic tenure and academic freedom and the various rights that academics have as essentially civil servants, because most universities, at least that I'm aware of in Europe, are publicly funded. I'm aware there's private universities, and they're much more common in the US. But academic tenure exists for a reason, exactly because of the things that Victor was saying, that we have the right to speak truth to power in many contexts. Although the reason I was maybe laughing in a bad way is because I'm aware that in the US, some universities don't have tenure anymore, don't give new staff tenure. And also the EU or the European model of tenure is very different. So it's not that it necessarily doesn't exist, but it's very different, even though it has some overlap. But I also think that, yeah, in general, academics are not as independent as they were probably even 10 years ago. And again, I think these are all part of the same cultural forces. And I think it links in many ways to the role of the university also changing, at least in my lifetime. The role of the university is now seen as, in some sense, maybe providing education, I guess, which is fine. This is a fine role. But the other role of the university, which is knowledge production, has completely left the big picture and the public understanding and even our colleagues' understanding. It's all become about, these kind of market forces. So like, what do they give, what concrete things, what applied things does the university produce? And this all ties, in many ways to the destruction of understanding, because understanding isn't a product. It can't be predefined. If you could predefine it, then you've already understood it. So clearly, new knowledge isn't about preset things. But also, I think when it comes to theory, the weird thing is that people seem to really stumble into, and again, I think this is a relatively new thing, they just stumble into this idea that somehow an apparatus or a model or whatever that produces sort of arithmetic, that kind of prediction, not the qualitative kind, arithmetic predictions, is somehow scientific. But this is a nonsense. A video of a person also produces very strong predictions of, I don't know, like if you video me running and then I also run, there'll be incredible predictions in that video of what I look like. It's neither a theory nor it's nothing. It's basically nothing. It has nothing to do with understanding. And I think this idea that that scientific understanding is somehow deeply tied to data and quantized information, and specifically things like collecting data. It's a very strange thing because, of course, data is useful, especially if you already have an understanding to then explore it and test it and support it and so on. But I mean, it's not, there's a reason we say that data underdetermines theory. It's because it actually is a red herring. It's not even the case. So, for example, there are some things, even just basic common sense, that can help you work through this. That there are things that we do understand very well in daily life. So I like to say the example of like a glass. If I'm holding a glass and I tell you, yeah, I'm gonna throw this on the floor, everyone can predict in a non-numerical way what's gonna happen. But if it bounces and doesn't break, it won't really change and that happens. Like safety glass exists, or weird things happen, right? Or carpets exist. But it's not going to change anything. And that would be like a sort of numerical contradiction. You'd go in and you'd measure like, oh, it didn't break. But it wouldn't change your understanding of the properties of a glass hitting the floor. Not in any deep sense. You would just say, okay, yeah, sometimes that doesn't happen. And I think, and also you didn't come up with that because you saw millions of glasses breaking, by the way. You could come up with that also if you will come up with that just by knowing some facts about the world. You don't have to witness firsthand any of these things specifically happening, even though of course it's a common event and people have seen it. So I think this is just common sense, but some scientific understanding is not that different from common sense. And it's this kind of operationalization or like datification that even creates these confusions that are related to AI, right? Because contemporary AI, in many senses, because it depends on vast reams of data, it's sort of like foreclosed the potential to have understanding. Because like Victor said, understanding isn't about some nonsense that you can't interpret by definition. So a whole data center's worth of data isn't understanding But the thing I just said about a glass falling on the floor and shattering, that's for free. You didn't have to, I don't know, like burn down the rainforest. So I think when we talk about cognitive science and computational modeling, it's also the case that, yes, a lot of the models from cognitive science and AI have huge overlap. And in fact, many of our colleagues think they might have complete overlap. But this is part of that nonsense with the confusion of what the role of theoretical understanding is. And I want to let Iris say something, because I see her smiling.
This is just a great. I don't know if Aga wanted to pick another topic. No, yeah, yeah, I agree. I also think not just are these, in a sense, compressions or statistical models of data not understanding. I feel it's at least embodied in contemporary AI technologies, also as used in science, even in cognitive science, by the way. Because that was one of the concerns I had. This actually is making cognitive science worse if we confuse these theories or these systems as theories of mind or of cognition, because they're decoys. Because I feel they're even distortions. So it's not just that they are some copy, like the video that you said of you running, or a compression. They're also not, I feel like your example, what was it, of the steam engine or something like that, because I think probably that's the self-image. Oh, we're going to figure out stuff by trying. I think no, but this is a scam. It's not that it's trying to, even if you think about what is really the purpose of these systems, like what are the function, what is the aim, I have a sense none of these are, it's maybe interesting, this topic, that the functions aren't tied to the system, the actual properties of the system and its true capabilities, other than maybe convincing people of that the system has certain capabilities, and this makes them buy into certain things. I was also thinking, so two links on the earlier analogy with what was it, mass production, cheap clothing, that I felt, yeah, if a cheap shoe is made, it's a shoe and I can wear it. I'm also reminded of I think Olivia also made this analogy. What is it like if you actually take what was it, the ambulance to the hospital, maybe has also a still polluting thing, but at least it brings you to the hospital. And I feel, but I'm curious what you think about it, that AI technologies, at least as currently are pushed, are worse than this. They're not cheap versions that maintain proper functionality. I feel they have no proper functionality other than making money. So I'm wondering sort of where these analogies may break down, and what other people here think about this. Do they break? And if they break down, is it useful to have other analogies? I have no answers.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think that's where we, right, like I think this analogy makes some sense within limits, as you rightly pointed out, on the consumption side. And I think that is, as always, one has to start thinking about the production side as well. And then one has to ask, what are these things actually for? And I think one of the big confusions that I think reigns in the media discourses around AI is that we've been trained for many decades to think in economic categories like productivity. And we think, well, productivity is when you get to make more with less. And that's good because, even if capitalism does bad things sometimes with that, we could use it for more free time or whatever, right? But I think it's really important to think about not just productivity, but about how different technologies changed power relations in society. And there, I think the analogy that we should look at is for AI is actually Taylorism. So Taylorism is a historic ancestor of many modern managerial schools of thought. And Harry Braverman famously called it the explicit verbalization of the capitalist mode of production. And what Taylorism is all about is to say you want to concentrate all knowledge of production processes among management, so that workers can't derive special bargaining power from their special knowledge where they know things that management doesn't know. But most importantly, so that management can analyze all aspects of a production process and separate them out so that everything requires as little economically valuable skill as possible. Right? Ultimately, it's aimed at making every worker in every position as replaceable as possible, because that increases the supply and therefore reduces the cost by the laws of supply and demand. Right? The easier it is to replace a worker, the less special bargaining power they can derive from the knowledge required for that position. Right? So that mode of separating out tasks and de-skilling people in this economic sense, which doesn't mean they have fewer skills, which is another aspect that AI also does, but it means they have less economic and political power that they can derive from the skills that they do have. Right? That reduction in skill that Taylorism is aimed at, which operates through transferring knowledge into management, is, I think, one of the goals that really sits behind the development of AI, where there's an attempt to also make people more replaceable, even if the product is at a shittier quality, perhaps to the point of it actually being harmful, but as long as you can sell it, good. But what that does is it doesn't increase productivity. It doesn't mean you get to do more with less time. It decreases labor costs. And one of the very crucial things, where I'm always trying to bring it back to the general operations of capitalism, is that from the perspective of capital can't be distinguished. Because if you save time per unit output, that saves labor cost. But if you just cut the wage costs in half, that looks the same, because they're both about the price of labor per unit output has been reduced. But one time you've increased the overall pie. You're like, yeah, well, there may be harms, but we've produced more. There's more that can be overall consumed. But the other time you've maybe lowered the quality of the product, but you have shifted some of the value that can be derived from the production process away from workers. And if it doesn't go to wages, if it doesn't go to the worker, then it stays on the half side of the balance sheet of the company, the capital, whatever you want to call it, right? So there's a sense there in which I think we really have to think about production processes as being deeply interwoven with the way that class power and struggles in society over how the things that we all collectively produce get distributed. But these are deeply interwoven, and I think a lot of people, even people with a materialist background, tend to think of the production process as something that we can just take for granted, and then the political process happens afterwards. But if we want to understand what's happening with AI, we need to think about Taylorism as a structure of bringing class power into the concrete individual labor processes, and about AI as something that does something akin to that, which tries to shift knowledge away from workers and into technology. And then I think we can tie this all together with this, why is understanding so irrelevant to capitalism? Because understanding is exactly the kind of thing that produces extra labor costs, right? It's the thing that people have to be paid for. So if we can somehow have the predictions, but without the understanding, in a sense, that's like the logical endpoint towards which one of these tendencies of capitalism pushes, right? The idea of having anything that can be special skills, special knowledge, be not human, but a property of a thing that can be owned, of capital itself, right? And then we should very loudly, especially as scientists, but also as any kind of human, say that is a very inhuman world. Maybe that is the most efficient world according to certain economic theories, but it is a horrible world that is not good.
Here. Yeah.
Did you want to say more, Iris?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things, but indeed, I completely agree. I also completely agree with this understanding of de-skilling, just to be clear, because it's not just about, it's about if our skills are of value, unfortunately, in this frame. And this is exactly why they try to buy academia. So many academics also have tech company affiliations or funding. It's also why they attack the academics who they can't buy, not only because we speak out, but also because if they attack us, in some sense, eventually you acquiesce, either actually as an academic, or they just take your work. You know, they put your work into the AI, for example, like they did with people's books. Iris's book, by the way, was one of them. The other thing I wanted to say is, you said make more with less, which is like obviously what they're trying to do. But I want to say that I think actually what they're going to end up doing is making less with more. And we already see it, because the amount of effort needed in these systems is completely obfuscated. I mean, they're essentially using the whole of human digital output that they can access to perform this. And this is also why they need coal. You know, they're starting up burning coal, or they've already done that, and they need to build data centers everywhere, on and on, right? So this is definitely making less with more, because it also is less in the sense that if the products are significantly worse or even completely useless, which is also the case with clothes. Like, I think everyone notices these days that cheap clothes in some sense don't exist anymore, because you wash it once and it's gone. You could definitionally say that's not clothes anymore, right? So that's the same as in some sense what's happening with the so-called output or the so-called products of the AI industry, in the sense that if you use a contemporary AI model to create text, I don't know if people here have had the experience I've had, but in the last few weeks, I've had to review papers for various places. One of them allows AI in the writing process. So authors are allowed. I started reading a paper without knowing, just to be clear, without knowing this. And I was like, I can't read this. What's going on? This is nonsense. And then I scrolled to the end and I see that it was written that the authors used, I won't say the name because I don't have to advertise for them, but they use one of these products, and it's an anti-advert in some sense, but whatever. They use one of these products, and because they're worried about their language skills, this was explicitly said, like, English is not our native language. So and I'm like, this is not English in a sense. It was grammatically correct English, but it was treacle. Like, my brain is just, I can't read this. So I told them in the review. But the point is, this is making less with more, because they didn't make a paper. It's unreadable. And the other point is, if you think of the labor theory of value, if no labor is going in, or if it's all derivative damaged labor, then eventually there will be nothing of value in every sense. So what will happen, in my sort of optimist, it's a pessimist disguised as an optimist disguised as a pessimist view, is that eventually better stuff will have to be the case. Because if all our clothes are melting off us, of course they're also made using slave labor and child labor. If they're all melting off us, I have clothes from the 80s that are completely fine, whereas something that I bought last month has fallen to bits. I mean, eventually this is unsustainable, because unlike AI nonsense, like, we need clothes. We don't all live, I don't know, in the tropics or wherever, where I guess you could wear a lot less. But the point is, that's not an option. So I do think this is an unsustainable, not in a good way. Like, I think a lot of harm will happen, but it is unsustainable in the long run. And when it collapses, I think, yeah, a lot of bad things will happen. But it just can't be the case that, you know, the ambulance example that Iris gave, that I like to say, that I like to use, is that yes, an ambulance typically pollutes. Even an electric ambulance will pollute, right? All of these products have some kind of pollution, whether it's literally in the atmosphere or through, whatever, mining. But the point is, it gets you where you want. And if it stops doing that, we see what happens, because we saw what happened to the car industry lately when people decided that a certain company's cars are no good. So I don't know. I have some slight optimistic streak. And I think, all they want is to sell. But in the end, they won't be able to sell, because it will all be nonsense, and we will all see that it's nonsense. I don't think I'm some kind of I mean, yeah, I am an expert, but I don't think I'm like a super expert on reading more than that. Like almost everyone, I suspect, would have had trouble reading something as dense, I don't know, dense is the wrong word, but as difficult to read. So everyone will eventually start to notice this after the sort of novelty of not having to write an essay wears off.
Yeah, I think that I like the optimism. I think we also shouldn't leave the optimism about the uses of science and technology to the people who want to use science and technology to destroy understanding and produce power for a few billionaires, right? There is a real way in which we won't be able to get out of many of society's problems. We won't be able to solve climate change without technology, but we can also not let them get away with the claim that technology is the only source of solution, precisely because technology is always about power. Technology embeds and produces its own kinds of decisions. It can actually lead very much into a trap where you produce cheaper and cheaper, where you just produce more and more without that being a more in the sense of quality of life, right? So I feel like, I think as a society, we need to be optimistic in the sense of we can come up with better modes of decision making than market power. We can make more democratic modes of decision making. We can imagine that the development of technology is not just so that you can be de-skilled and can be cheaper, but so that the less pleasant parts of work can be automated and the more interesting, more creative, more social aspects of work can be strengthened, right? So I think, pointing out that the project that they call the techno-optimist project is really a techno-fascist project, and that optimism about technology would really be about technology empowering us individually and collectively to make more democratic, less market-based decisions. I think we are at time at this point. Do you all want to give a little closing spiel, or? We can also not have a closing spiel. We already kind of did a closing spiel, so if that's fine, we can just cut this part.
I wanted to add one thought, that it doesn't need to be a closing spiel, and you also can cut it. To add the optimism, I also add, I like the optimism, and it's very important indeed also to hope and to be optimistic about people's ability to resist. And I also see already people choosing, and sometimes also advertise, like no AI options, and people actively looking for this. And I think not only experts, I feel people are also noticing sort of the AI slop and sort of the terrible aesthetics of it, and I also think it will wear down, and it will. I think especially maybe even for younger generations, that it is more symbolic for artificial in the meaning of fake and bad. And so I share this idea that yeah, that the human creativity and also the appreciation, humans will be creative to actually, because we are much smarter and more creative, to show that, but also seek it, I think, and just reject it as being fake. It's not a closing spiel, but some thoughts to follow up on what Olivia said.
Could I add to that? Okay. Yeah. I'm optimistic, and part of my optimism, I think, related to what Olivia said too about like it being unsustainable, is I mean, I do when I think of like 2023 when like this boom kind of started, I guess culturally, to now. I think sentiment has changed so much about these technologies, and not even just these technologies, but social media, like big tech in general. I think that's an opportunity. When I was like in high school, I don't know, it felt like, no one was really like, oh, should I be on social media? Is Facebook bad or whatever? And now that's just such a constant, I don't know, shared thing. And you have to be kind of very ignorant or putting on blinders to not see it's that it's just not fun, or it's not a good time online. And I think the task for us though, so I have optimism there that the sentiment is there and growing. I think the task left for us cognitive scientists, maybe people who want a more just form of societal organization, one task is to help people translate these emotions, these sentiments into arguments, into understanding, I guess, right? I have kind of a Paulo Freire kind of take on like, one of the purposes of education is to learn how to articulate your sort of experience of oppression, and to be able to say that. And I think it's important, one, to avoid like a reactionary approach to technology that doesn't actually target the sort of root problems and is instead like I don't know, some nihilistic, that can so easily go like into some far right reactionaryism, right? So I think it's important for that to kind of ground things, but also to make people connect these sentiments to, potential systemic understanding that they can also articulate to others and actually be like, I don't know, persuasive about, other than just being like, the vibes are bad. I don't know. So I think I'm optimistic, and that's where I think one of the big tasks is going forward.
Is this where I plug the book and I'm like, hopefully this lovely book called Why We Fear AI totally might help you do that. No, very, very nicely put, everyone. Olivia, did you want to say something?
I feel like I said what I think in the maybe specific case on the AI slop, or just the use of AI in some sense is unsustainable. But will eventually lead, I think, basically like Victor and Iris said, and has led, in fact, to younger people actually recognizing this. I mean, we probably all have relatives who are older than us who fall for these things, and I think it's the younger generation who are in some senses self-educating themselves on what AI slop or looks like, or media literacy, which are again all things that are actually vital skills. But yeah, the way I see it is that the shift that has happened indeed from 2023 to now is that more and more people are recognizing that to be anti-contemporary AI products is not to be anti-technology, because that's also a nonsense position. So both both are nonsense positions. So being anti-technology across the board is a nonsense position, because glasses, spectacles, we're all wearing them, are a classic example of technology that I don't think anyone is against, or I would hope. Yeah, there have been cases actually historically where people have been against people who wear glasses. But anyway, that's a very bad thing. So that's a great example of how essentially no one in their right minds is against wearing glasses. However, it's also a nonsense to infer that criticizing a technology implies being against all technologies. I mean, you can cigarettes are a technology too, right? So I think we've seen people's understanding of what it means to take a position against contemporary AI mature. They have matured in their understanding, and I think that's a huge, in some sense, that's a huge win, because indeed, when Facebook appeared on the scene, Instagram, so on, all these social media platforms, there wasn't really a deep critique. And then when the critique did appear on the scene, it was also immature. It also needed to mature. And I think, yeah, in some sense, this from 2023 to now is much quicker than the development of the critique of social media. So I think, yeah, I'm very optimistic from that perspective. But I also think it's important to remember that people are being harmed and will continue to be harmed in this process. And I think it's also, important to remember that, because understanding the world, which was what we were talking about in the last hour, requires, dualities or a multifaceted understanding. We have to accept that, yes, good things may be, on the horizon, or better things than now, but not at the cost of forgetting that other people are also being harmed. And I think some people's future, just like with the financial crisis in the previous 2 decades ago, some people's lives were deeply, irrevocably changed. I mean, I think my generation has had that, so I think that's also important to remember. But yes, optimistically, 2023 to 2026, massive growth on the correct anti-AI front.
Well, that was an excellent summary. Thank you, everyone. I think we've implicitly made the case about any critique of technology having to be a social critique of technology. Olivia just made the case for saying it has to be dialectical. It has to evoke dualities and understand, AI in the context of what kind of world do we want to live in. We have to understand AI not just as a thing that does harm, though that is important, but as a thing that is a form of politics, especially a form of politics from above, and capitalism not as a natural system, but as a system that allocates power and decision power, and that this is a move in that game, and we should play our counter game in that arena. So I'm super glad to have talked to you all. This was very fun. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much too.